Hello, young people of the internet. Welcome to another episode of the Bill of Rights Institute's Bright and Early web series, where we talk about today's current events and what we're thinking about and help you think about things with us. So, as always, I am here with my colleagues, Gary and Kirk.
Hello.
And we have a very special guest today, which is another colleague of ours, the Institute, the author, Tony Williams. Yay!
Hey.
Hello, everyone. How are you?
Yeah, good to see you. Thanks for coming.
Thanks
Thanks for joining us, Tony.
Good to be here. I haven't seen all of you in person in a few weeks, so it's good to see all of your smiling faces.
It's been a minute, right? So we are so grateful that you have time to come talk to us today about creativity and journaling and our process of documentation of our lives. You're working on your 7th book now, and so we are going to look to you to kind of give us some insight into the creative process and how we should think about documenting what's happening right now. But first, I want to check in with everybody. How are you all doing?
Doing all right, doing okay. You know, the weeks are passing. I think you're, hitting a stride of starting to start new things and kind of getting used to the things I have to do and the things I want to do.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I'm finding myself making more phone calls and reaching out to more people, and I guess finding different ways of communicating that seem to get lost when we're busier running around and doing everything we do when we're not all not traveling and not going anywhere.
Right. I definitely am reaching deeper into my community bench at this point, right? So people I haven't talked to or checked in with for a while. But then we've gotten to the point where there is a bit of a rhythm now and a pacing. And so the thoughts on what my creative outlets are going to be in the next couple of months have started to burble up. How are you doing, Tony?
Doing great. Lots of family time. Finding some quiet moments to walk my dog many miles per day. Like a lot of people, our poor pets are getting their legs walked off, and reading a lot of books and watching a lot of great movies with my son especially. And so, we're making the best of it.
Absolutely. Well, as we're thinking about kind of what the next couple of months looks like, we all have to start planning for what our time is going to be filled with. And I think that's where this conversation came out. That's what this conversation came out of, is thinking about what documentation do we use to both process what's happening right now, but also leave behind so that we remember what's happening right now. So I think Gary, I know, has been thinking about what he's doing and how maybe you can join him in that journey. So go ahead, Gary.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think everything we've been discussing is how I'm feeling. We're all on the same page, I think, because as history fans, I think we've established we're all sort of history fans. There's an interesting part to that, because so often we're reading other people's history, things that have happened long before we were around, but also that we are always living through it. So I think something Kirk was saying before is interesting about how we're communicating with others and maybe doing it in a way we haven't, because I do have to say lately something I've gotten back into from a very long time ago that I haven't is letter writing. I have my stationery and my envelope and my stamps, and there's something about longhand writing. Sure, I'm still texting people and things like that, but there's something about sitting down and writing out this experience is a bit different and a bit more powerful in a strange way. So if anybody watched an early episode of ours, I'm a big fan of journaling, and I think that's really important. And a lot of the historical record we have is luckily preserved writings of people who were perhaps writing for themselves, as you would with journals. But letters are really interesting too, because it's still capturing your experience of what's going on, but it's for someone else. And so that is at the same time a very powerful thing to do for yourself, but also can be very powerful to see. Can I share one thing that we've got? Part of what I like to reference was a letter that we have in our curricula. This is in our curriculum in immigration, but it's a letter from Mary Garvey, and it's from 1850, and it's to her mother. And it's a really interesting letter that I don't know was intended to be read by students of history in the future. But it's just a really powerful way that someone was expressing just very clear sort of thoughts, but it captures what's going on. I mean, I noticed in the beginning here, the first paragraph, she starts off by saying, "My dear mother, I write these few lines to you, hoping that you are now and will continue to be in good health when these shall reach you." And it reminds me so much of something I'm so used to saying now to friends about being well and being okay, and it really means something. And so the writing that I'm thinking of is very voluntary when it comes to letters, but I'm still writing and recording things because, you know, I'm working, right? And so I'm thinking a lot about the skills of writing, and that's why I'm so happy that Tony's here, and Kirk, and you all write. But I've seen the two of you before, so Tony's new. So I think about that a lot. I think about a lot of our resources, that there's a structure in a way to writing that frees you up. And so this is part of just the many resources. I can't show you everything that we have on writing, but it's really helpful. Part of what I think of when it comes to creative writing is having that structure really helps. And I learned a lot, not from necessarily doing it, but that is kind of the way, right? You start off just practicing it and not worrying about it. But also my experience when I was teaching. So I was the coach of our literary magazine. So we took look at a lot of things like poetry. This is one of my favorite books, by the way. It's The Making of a Poem by Mark Strand and Eavan Boland. And really, we found that giving structure freed you up. Sometimes I found, and I don't know if you all feel this way, that a blank page itself can be a wall. Can be a really difficult thing to get over, because there's this feeling like it has to be perfect before you even put the first word down. And so the students and I, when we worked together, found that having some kind of constraints could make beautiful things. And they did. And there wasn't to worry about it. I mean, this is an example of the zine that we put out. And it went through phases and drafts and worked through it. But there was such a joy in that, that I just highly recommend just trying it, tossing it out there. And if you'll give me another moment, I want to talk about just another, it's an organization that really helped me through with all this, which is—
Me too. I love—
You too?
Yeah, this has been a goal of mine throughout life. I've never really gotten there in the month of November.
It started, exactly. This is National Novel Writing Month, or NaNoWriMo, I guess, is that what's right? I've never heard it said.
Yeah,
NaNoWriMo, probably. But it started as just a way to encourage people to write. In the original form is to write a novel in a month. But it's really turned into this really supportive program. It's a nonprofit that helps people of all ages, and they're really focusing on young writers too a lot, just to say, you know, you have this burning thing inside you, whether or not it's truth or fiction, and there are ways to have support to just try doing it, and you'll see what amazing things happen. And so I encourage all of us to say, best thing to do, just give it a shot. And I think you'd be surprised. And I think it's so cool. And it's making this a better time.
Absolutely. And I think what we're encouraging all of you out there to do is to kind of remove the filter of schoolwork and performance, and do this as an act of externalizing what's happening internally for you. Because as Kirk is going to mention in a bit, we have a lot of records, not only of letters that people were writing that showcased their internal struggles with what was happening in their time and in their moment, but also a lot of journals where people were doing it for themselves. And then also, I'll talk about a little later, a lot of art, which is both for the self and for the other. Often. So art goes both ways, journaling goes both ways, letter writing goes both ways. Mary Garvey, as Gary said, likely did not know that we would be reading her letter 150 years later on the internet to young people around the United States. I
It's
don't
probably unlikely.
imagine she knew that.
Yeah.
But it was fulfilling a need for her. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kirk, as he often does, to give us some context for the kinds of writing and documentation and all the primary sources. We love primary sources. At some point, no one was thinking about having a primary source. They were just externalizing some need that they had to communicate, right? And so, Kirk, take it away.
Yeah, that's right. No, thinking about what Gary was talking about with the letter of Mary Garvey, I think is a great example of this, right? When we think about history and we think about how things are recorded, they're not all laid out for us, right? And so the job of historians is to take things like the letter of Mary Garvey and sort of knit them together and breathe life into them, and so that they become a story that we can follow and interpret and understand and analyze. And there's lots of ways of doing that. I'm going to pull up Mary Garvey's letter again because I think it's interesting looking at it from different perspectives. So we're thinking about Mary Garvey, and so what we know that she is an Irish immigrant who has moved to the United States. But historians look at this and they start to ask a bunch of different questions. So, for example, how long did it take this letter to get across the Atlantic back to her home? How is it that they were traveling back and forth? What was it that she was doing in the United States? And how do all of those answers tell us things about the Atlantic world and about the economy that was existing and about sort of the society that Mary Garvey was living in? Whether or not, she had, what opportunities she had, how it was she was going about her day. All of those are questions that historians tackle. And it's amazing how many of those questions are raised in just a simple letter. So as we're experiencing the current pandemic and things that we're recording, we have to keep in mind, we don't have to keep in mind, but we do have the opportunity to have in mind that our reflections and the things that we're observing are actually really powerful for historians of the future to really know what it's like to live during this time. Because no matter how detailed the stories that we tell and that we remember and how good our memory is, at a certain point, we're going to have to relay that to somebody else who did not live through this period. And how that happens and how historians will understand it is really going to be built on the records that we have, whether or not it's the newspapers that we're reading or whether or not it's the TikTok videos that we're creating, or it's the letters that we're writing and the things that we're recording. All of those things will add up to the narrative that's built. And so we have an opportunity to be a part of that, which I think is really powerful and interesting. And I'm excited that we have Tony here because Tony has actually worked through a very similar incident in one of his previous books, The Pox and the Covenant. I was hoping that he could just talk to us a little bit about what that process was like, how it is that he strung together these different primary sources, these different letters and logs and things to create a story. So, Tony, why don't we start just by telling us a little bit about what The Pox and the Covenant is about and how it is you came upon that topic?
Right, sure. I'd love to, Kirk. Thank you. The Pox and the Covenant was a book that came out about 10 years ago and has a lot of relevance to today because it's about a smallpox epidemic in Boston in 1721 and the discovery, the introduction of smallpox inoculation. Right, so it's a great medical discovery amidst this devastating epidemic, but it set off a firestorm of debate because, very curiously, and what drew me to the story originally is that Cotton Mather and the Puritan ministers were the ones who introduced the inoculation, supported by just one doctor, and were opposed by the doctors of Boston and a young Benjamin Franklin and his brother, who actually started an anti-inoculation newspaper. The historical facts are sometimes more interesting than stories we can make up. And so it's a really fascinating twist on that. And so it made me read more biographies about them and read more books about colonial America and try to figure out what was going on. And then I started digging around the primary sources, started reading the letters and diaries of Cotton Mather, which have been preserved and are available at my local university library. And started reading through letters that Benjamin Franklin wrote, as well as William Douglas, who was an opponent of smallpox. And very interestingly and very useful for historians, Puritan Massachusetts around this time was a highly literate society. They had a strong educational system and they really promoted literacy so that people could read the Bible, but they also read newspapers and pamphlets and material coming out of Europe. And so they wrote there were 2 newspapers in town, and they also wrote pamphlets for and against the inoculation. So it was a kind of a treasure trove of different primary sources that I could use to piece all this together and try to understand the motivations of the people involved, and really, like a detective, put the story together in a narrative form.
So in that process, Tony, I guess it sounds like you kind of get to know these people. Is that the case? I mean, do you feel like you actually are speaking to them at a certain point?
Well, I really try to do that. I felt like in this book, probably more than any other, I think I did. And I think one of the reasons why is I really try to not only just read their letters and their diaries and so forth, but to put myself in their shoes, to understand, how would Cotton Mather was a public figure, but he was also a father. And so when his son came to him to get the smallpox inoculation, which could have resulted in his death, I had to think about how I was a father as well. And so I try to make kind of those human connections and think about human nature and human interactions, and to try to figure out, well, it's fine and great for Mather to promote this for Boston, but how would he react to his own son doing it? Or it was first tested, this inoculation practice, on Dr. Zabdiel Boylston, who was the doctor who tested it first. He tested it on a 6-year-old son. And I had a 6-year-old, my son was 6 years old at the time, and I was trying to think, would I test this on him? It was very interesting trying to get into their heads and step into their shoes for a little bit, and to think about how I would react in similar circumstances. It wasn't always easy, but I think I have a little bit more of an understanding now, even in 2020, with our pandemic and our reaction to it. It helps bring a little bit more understanding, even 10 years after I wrote the book.
Very cool. Well, so that book is available on, I'm assuming, Amazon and all of the places one can buy books.
It's out of print, sadly, but yes, you can find used copies all over the internet.
Okay, so we can find used copies all over the internet, and I'm sure people will want to grab those up. So let's talk about the present moment for you, Tony, as a creative, as someone who has a lot to say about a lot of different things. I know you're working on a new book, but what is the creative process for you right now? How are you working through kind of that process?
Well, I'm doing, I have more time at home now to do that. And so even though there are more people around the house than normal, it's still pretty similar in terms of doing research and primary sources. Luckily, I have a lot of books behind me, and I have the internet at my fingertips, but I can't really go to libraries right now. So that actually does make research a little different. But I'm still able to get everything that I need to done. And it's just really, it's like, exercising your muscles or whatever. You just have to do it every day, and you have to have the discipline to just sit down and do it. And even if the words aren't coming out perfectly, or you're feeling a little frustrated because you're not finding the exact source you want, to just sit down and put pen to paper or fingers to computer pad, and just to sit down and do it, and to try to do it every day.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Tony. I think there's a lot to learn both from that experience you had of writing the book 10 years ago and kind of personalization that you went through in your research. There's things to learn about your technique. And you mentioned that one of your practices is that you heavily outline in order to overcome the burden of that blank page that Gary was talking about. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right, sure.
Yeah,
it's scary, right?
Similarly, yeah.
Yeah, and that writer's block, it's not fun, right, for anyone, and we've all been there for sure. But one of my secrets, just even for myself, is to try to avoid it in the first place. And the way I do that is I really outline everything really thoroughly. I follow that model I learned in 6th grade myself, when I learned Roman numeral 1, 2, and capital A and B, and 1, 2, 3, all that. That system, I actually still use it today. So I really suggest all the students listening today really, really take that to heart, because what it does is it helps me organize my thoughts logically. I throw my creative ideas down, what I want to argue. I put all the primary sources and evidence in my outline. And so everything is highly structured, and it's drudgery and it takes a lot of work, but it pays off when I sit down and write out sentences, write out paragraphs, get the flow going in the chapters. Everything has already been laid out in the outline. So it's really, really important part of, I think, my writing process. And when I was a teacher, I try to encourage my students to do it as well.
That's good. It's always nice to be reminded of that, whether you've written 7 books and have been doing this a while, or kind of starting fresh, that there's going to be wins and there's going to be frustrations, and it's okay to keep working through it. And you have breakthroughs probably, and then you have times where you feel like you hit a wall, but then you work through it. So it's always, no matter how often you write, it's good to be reminded of that.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's true.
And so I think one of the things that most young people out there today, and you guys can let us know if I'm on the mark or not, is you have a lot going on right now. You have a lot of assignments. It's the end of the semester. AP testing is coming up. Decisions that you're having to make for your summer and for next school year are all very vague and unclear. They're just as unclear for us as I'm sure they are for you. But you're more into the decisions that are being made right now, and there's a lot of lack of clarity. And so sometimes there's the academic writing and the academic kind of creative work that goes into that. But then the truly creative expression is a different process, and it fills a different need for you than your academic writing. And so I want to talk really quickly about where we can go to find inspiration creatively, who we can look for to find inspiration creatively. So firstly, I think that there are a number of things that we can learn from poetry right now. So Gary mentioned his favorite book. What was the name of that book?
It is The Making of a Poem. It's an anthology of poetic forms by Mark Strand and Eavan Boland. It just kind of walks you through examples of the structures of poems in a really interesting way.
And when I think I was between the ages of 13 and 15, I think I wrote about 500 poems, because that was the way that I was externalizing what I was going through. And so when I think about ways to process big, deep things that are happening, poetry always comes to me as a way to do that. This is a great selection of poems. They're at the Christian Science Monitor, saying poems to remind us of our strength in quarantine. And I love this opening from the editor. And it says, Robert Frost wrote that poetry is a momentary stay against the confusion of the world. And so there are lots of great places to go for poetry online. There are famous poems at poets.org or poetry.org. And then there are all the poems that end up going around the internet in their variety of forms. My one caveat is always make sure you know the attribution, because a lot of poems will get misattributed. So there's a little bit of digital literacy work there sometimes when you see an image and a poem together. But so there's poetry to do, but then we also can learn from the great artists. So if you're not familiar with Frida Kahlo and her life and work, she struggled with physical difficulties for most of her life. And she used that difficulty to really inspire her art, and to take the pain and difficulty that she was experiencing and externalize it. This is a really fascinating image of her painting on a body cast that she had to wear for a long time. And so she was taking her internal struggle and externalizing it on her physically through painting the body cast. If you're not familiar with this website, this is the History Chicks podcast. It's a great podcast that focuses on women in history. I love it. I've loved it for years. And they'll have 1, 2, or 3 episodes that cover the life of a particular historically significant woman. The last thing I want to talk about kind of brings this all together. So if you've ever listened to a TED Talk or a TEDx talk, as I'm sure you have, you know that often they can be really powerful. This is one of my favorite authors. She did a TED Talk on the nature of creativity a long time ago. That's one of my favorite TED Talks of all time. Her name's Elizabeth Gilbert. She wrote the book Eat, Pray, Love, and then she went on to write a number of books about the creative process. And they just had this beautiful conversation. She just had a beautiful conversation with the founder of the TED organization named Chris Anderson, and all about what to do with your big emotions and feelings right now. And so this is an hour-long kind of conversation with a really nice transcript feature where if you click on it, it'll take you directly to that part of the video. But I wanted to focus on two real quick passages that I think are just so powerful. So right here at 26, she says that she doesn't think creativity right now necessarily means that you need to write the great American novel or start the business. It doesn't need to be literal. We're going to create new worlds and new lives on the other side of this, and we're going to be doing that individually and collectively. I think of the shoots of small trees that can only come up after massive forest fires where seed pods have to explode under great heat. We're in a kind of crucible moment now. And there's all this creativity that's going to come out of it. And it's this really take what you are feeling and experiencing and externalize it in whatever way makes you happy and lets you feel the moment clearly. She then goes on to say down at 31 that she suggests that doing what you thought, what you enjoyed doing at age 10. So earlier in the talk, she talks about how people are always like, find your passion, find your passion. And she's like, that's a lot of pressure. Just be creative right now. Do what makes you feel happy and relaxed. And she says often that's creativity in play. And she mentions that she was an anxious child and that at an early age, children with anxiety learn that they can help manage that with their curiosity and their play. Usually at adolescence, that changes and we become more anxious and more external, and we lose that sense of play. But she encourages us to go back to what made us happy at age 10. Whatever it was, get some Legos, get some coloring books, get your hands in the mud, do whatever it will to ground you in your own creativity and yourself, because that's going to make you able to serve others better in whatever's to come. So on that note, I want to ask my colleagues, do you have any thoughts or responses or things you want to tell our audience today before we close?
I mean, this was really amazing. And I have to say, it's funny that one of the last things you were talking about is going back to what made you comfortable, because I don't know if I even realized that when I was 10, I was a letter writer. I wrote to Charles Schultz to tell him how much I like peanuts, and I would write little notes to friends and things like this. And it's funny, I don't think I had realized until you said it, that there is finding great comfort in saying what is fundamentally something that I like. And it often is a pretty creative thing.
Yeah, I think that's great. I also really like that passage about getting your hands in the mud, because I think in addition to, I think there's a lot of emphasis right now on exercise, which is great. And, we've been talking about writing, which is something where you're sitting down and kind of focusing a little bit, but doing something physical with your hands can be really inspiring too. So whether or not that's getting in the kitchen and learning something new to cook, or it's going out safely, being social distance, and digging up and planting something in a garden, or picking up sticks, or just doing something with your hands. It's amazing how much that kind of physical activity can actually be really inspiring and can drive you to do some really interesting things.
Right. And, my kids are a little older. My daughter's in college. She had an internship that was canceled, and my son had his AAU basketball. We still don't know what's going to happen this summer. But I said, don't see this as, things being canceled, but rather seeing it as an opportunity. I told my daughter, well, take a college class instead, and something you just really want to, just for fun. Don't take something in your major, just take something for fun. And my son is finding new and creative ways to work out, and runs a couple of blogs on movies and so forth. So just finding new outlets and new opportunities, rather than looking at it as those opportunities denied. Just kick down some new doors.
And I love that all of this, and that moment at the end of the passage I read where Elizabeth Gilbert mentions that we're going to need all of you in the very near future. We're going to need all of the creative energy that every American, every person in the world can bring on the other side of all of this. So it's our duty right now to figure out how we can uplift ourselves to be able to bring that creativity. And let's start with some play and see where it takes us, because that is the essential characteristic of the entrepreneurial journey that will allow us to come out the end of the other side of this an ever more flourishing society. So on that note, I want to thank my colleagues. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Kirk.
Sure.
Thank you especially to
Yeah.
Tony Williams, author, who you can find on Twitter.
Yeah.
And thank you to all of you out there on the internet for all the amazing creative things that you're doing to support your communities. My name is Rachel. This is Bright and Early, and we will see you next time.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.